Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're dialed in today. Excellencies and honored colleagues, welcome. My name is Thomas Wuchty, and as the Executive Secretary of the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, or the IIJ as we are known, as one of the three GCTF-inspired institutions, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, I would like to express my thanks to everyone who's joining us virtually from around the world for this United Nations General Assembly side event on countering the transnational threat of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, or as we call it, REMVE, as well as to the distinguished speakers we will be hearing from later this morning. And I would particularly like to thank the governments of Sweden and the United States for supporting this event. The IIJ began work on REMVE in 2019 as part of our mission to deliver impactful and sustainable capacity building to criminal justice practitioners on how to address terrorism and related transnational criminal activities within a human rights and rule of law framework. With the REMVE threat on the rise transnationally, from autumn 2020 to 2021, we convened a series of 3 online expert meetings on countering REMVE. In fact, it was an excellent time during the pandemic that we were able to draw a wide variety of practitioners and experts together to really examine and look at how to bring this topic forward. We brought together practitioners from 20 countries and intergovernmental organizations across North America, Europe, and beyond. Drawing from these meetings, we developed the IIJ Criminal Justice Practitioner's Guide for Addressing REMVE, which offers valuable guidance on what governments can do about this threat in compliance with the rule of law, including through engagement with civil society and community stakeholders, which I would stress from our own experience. The IIJ published this practitioner's guide and launched it in English in July. And this week, we have also published it in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. All versions are now available on the IIJ website. I'm also happy to announce that in the next few months, the IIJ will begin using the guide as a basis for capacity building. We plan to bring together several groups of criminal justice practitioners, such as starting with prosecutors, investigators, prisons officials, from countries facing REMVE threats for a series of workshops which will also take into account the need for governments to engage with civil society and community actors. We believe that this international cooperation and approach is required to counter this growing threat. It's always visionary to turn words such as a practitioner's guide into real action with practitioners together. We'll now be hearing from 2 distinguished speakers who will discuss the challenges that governments face regarding REMVE and some of the ongoing efforts and notable recent steps taken to counter it. And for everyone participating, as you listen to their remarks, if you have questions for them, you can submit these using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen in your Zoom dial-in. Please, if possible, keep all your questions on topic and focused, so we can get to as many of them during the time of the Q&A or to follow up with you later. Now, I'd like to first introduce Mr. Irfan Saeed, the Acting Deputy Coordinator for Terrorism Prevention and Detention from the U.S. Department of State Bureau of Counterterrorism. Mr. Saeed manages offices that lead strategy and policy formulation for international terrorism prevention efforts, as well as international detention issues, and also serves as the Director of the Office of Countering Violent Extremism. Previously, Irfan served as the Director of Community Engagement Office in the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan, and as Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and as a criminal prosecutor at the state and federal levels. And I'm also proud to call him a good colleague and friend. Irfan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tom. Let me start with the very traditional greeting that we have these days. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see me? Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the nice words, Tom. You are a great friend and colleague, and everything that the IIJ is doing, I'm a huge fan of. So again, thank you and your team for all your efforts. And first, let me say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. I'm so happy to be here with everyone this morning. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues, both in my screen as well as outside of this screen. I should say that I think we're very close to meeting again in person, and I hope that at next year's gathering, next year's UN General Assembly High Level Week, we all have the opportunity to see each other in person. Let me reiterate my thanks to the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, and of course the government of Sweden, for joining the United States in sponsoring this very timely event. And of course, in this age of large virtual gatherings, we must thank our tech team because without them, none of us would be connected, none of us would be able to hear or see each other or have the ability to connect from so many disparate places around the world. So thanks again, tech team, greatly appreciated. So I think today we're going to talk about racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, and I know it's a term that we use here in the United States, but every country I think has their own term. But for us, I should start by saying that REMVE, countering REMVE, is an absolute priority for the United States and of course all of our international partners. We use REMVE to describe what is often referred to by many of our partners as violent white supremacy, far-right extremism, or white supremacy. But here in the United States, we feel racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism really captures what we're trying to accomplish here. I can tell you from President Biden's first day in office, he set in motion the framework to counter REMVE and domestic terrorism. In June of this year, the U.S. formally released the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, which lays out a comprehensive approach to addressing REMVE while safeguarding bedrock American civil rights and civil liberties. So this morning, I'll take just a few moments to discuss the threat as we see it and what the United States Department of State is doing to counter REMVE. I'm also pleased to announce later today the launch of an important new initiative aimed at bolstering the international community's focus on and understanding of the global threat posed by REMVE actors. So you'll have to wait till the end of my remarks for that very important launch. So let's talk about the threat real quick. REMVE threats, we all know, are often transnational, with groups and individuals radicalizing to violence, recruiting, and sharing tactical training across borders, both online and in person. We know these actors are increasingly interconnected, often online and across borders, sharing ideas, ideologies, and tactics. You know, it's common practice for us when we start these to talk about the threat to list the cities where there have been very nascent attacks, recent attacks of REMVE actors, and unfortunately that list becomes so long. But you know, we can track it from Christchurch to here in the United States in Pittsburgh, from Quebec City to Hanau in Germany. We have seen an escalation in violence perpetrated by REMVE actors around the world, who have adopted and amplified each other's manifestos and corrupt ideologies. And the lack of a clear command and control structure and the prevailing use of sophisticated encrypted technology makes these semi-formal networks that much more challenging to identify, counter, and dismantle. They misuse online platforms to propagate misinformation and disinformation and share tactics on how to establish and run training facilities, procure fraudulent travel documents, and clandestinely move people and material. And part of this transnational component includes violent white supremacists traveling overseas to train and fight with like-minded individuals. US-based REMVE actors have been known to communicate with and travel abroad to engage in person with foreign REMVE actors. And it happens every corner of the world. It's also vital for us to understand how REMVE actors and networks are raising, storing, and transferring funding, because we all know terrorists need money. So we need to crack down on this type of activity. Many attacks by REMVE individuals and groups are self-funded, but REMVE actors also raise money from a variety of licit and illicit sources, including things like merchandising, music sales, donations from individuals, criminal activity such as narcotics and weapons trafficking, and selling counterfeit goods, and also providing military-style training to many other violent extremists around the world. In contrast with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who often rely on informal financial institutions and networks, REMVE groups often use formal financial institutions out in the open, such as banks and monetary transmitters, to move funds domestically and internationally. Several REMVE groups are also known to use crowdfunding platforms and virtual currency to solicit donations and effect money transfers. So at the State Department, let me just give you a quick overview of what we're doing here, but I should also stress that we have a lot of domestic partners within the US government who are also very involved in the fight. But at the State Department, our role begins at our borders and extends internationally. We have a broad range of tools we use to counter the REMVE threat, which includes things like using terrorist sanctions, measures to detect and prevent terrorist travel, diplomatic engagement, public diplomacy, tech sector engagement, and leveraging foreign assistance resources. And I'll just give you a quick snapshot of each one of those areas. First, the State Department is focusing its counterterrorism-related designation authorities to counter the REMVE threat. You all may recall back in April of 2020, we designated the Russian Imperial Movement, or RIM, and 3 of its leaders as specially designated global terrorists. This was the first time we had ever designated REMVE actors using these State Department authorities. Employing these terrorist designations enables us to expose and isolate organizations and individuals and disrupt their terrorist activities, including by limiting their access to the US financial system and facilitating certain US law enforcement sanctions and actions. Second, the State Department plays a leading role in detecting and preventing international travel by terrorists, including REMVE actors. We're actively encouraging partner governments to nominate REMVE actors as appropriate into their national watch lists, as well as international law enforcement platforms, such as Interpol. This strengthens border security screening measures to better identify and counter REMVE travel globally. Third, through diplomatic engagement by US embassies abroad, the State Department proactively engages with foreign partners to bolster information sharing and cooperation on efforts to counter REMVE. Fourth, public diplomacy offers an effective, proven tool in countering REMVE. And this is where I'm a really big fan of some of our PD programs that we have around the world, because we're leveraging some of our international platforms to build the capacity of local governments through our public diplomacy initiatives to tackle the REMVE threat. So for instance, we have the International Visitor Leadership Program here in the US, where we have introduced international government and law enforcement officials to strategies used by the US government and local governments and private sector to prevent and respond to attacks on places like public gatherings and other soft targets, such as houses of worship, which we all know continues to be a target of REMVE actors. Fifth, engagement with the tech sector, and this is an important one. The State Department engages with our international community and our tech companies in the vitally important effort to counter the use of the internet for terrorist purposes by REMVE actors. The reliance on REMVE actors on online platforms and the misuse of these online platforms to radicalize, recruit, mobilize, inspire, communicate, fundraise, and organize to commit acts of violence makes this line of effort particularly important. It's important to stress here that we engage tech companies to share information about terrorist trends and tactics and ask that they consider voluntarily removing REMVE-related content when appropriate by establishing and enforcing rigorous terms of service that they have on their own sites that forbid the use of their platforms for terrorist purposes. And we've seen some success. As we designated RIM, we really saw a lot of these tech companies act voluntarily and accordingly. I should also stress that back in May in 2021, the United States formally joined the Christchurch call to action to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, pledging with New Zealand, France, and many other partners who are represented on this in this important meeting today, as well as private sector, technology partners, and civil society, to work together to address terrorist and violent extremist content online. The US does applaud the language in the Christchurch call, emphasizing the importance of respecting human rights and the rule of law, and including the protection of the freedom of speech. So finally, the State Department uses its foreign assistance funding to build our partners' capacity to address the REMVE threat. So our support of the IIJ and this REMVE initiative is an important example of that line of effort. The IIJ has been at the forefront of the international community's efforts to tackle the most difficult counterterrorism challenges, including REMVE, particularly in the rule of law space. I'm sure many of us were online and there virtually when in July, the IIJ launched a criminal justice practitioner's guide for addressing REMVE. If you don't have it, get it. I've got this very fancy fancy version here, but of course it's available online in numerous languages on the IIJ's public website. This guide provides practical and valuable guidance on how governments can effectively use criminal justice sector tools and legislation to address REMVE, and hopefully will be an important resource for years to come. I know in my time as a former federal prosecutor prosecuting these types of cases, it was these types of gatherings and these types of guides that really helped me learn how to investigate, arrest, and prosecute all types of terrorist actors. So let me just conclude by saying that earlier I talked about a launch, and this is where I'm going to announce the launch. We're going to announce a new initiative that the United States will be launching later this year. The Department of State and Justice will be establishing a counterterrorism law enforcement forum to increase international cooperation and bolster information sharing to counter the global REMVE threat. With the first meeting set to take place in Europe in late 2020, the Law Enforcement Forum will convene senior criminal justice and policy officials from over 20 governments and institutions. This forum will be a valuable platform to unite like-minded partners from around the world and close gaps in our collective understanding of REMVE networks, groups, and individuals, including how loosely affiliated REMVE groups operate, communicate, finance, recruit, train, and plot. The upcoming launch of the IIJ's training and capacity building workshops and the US-led Counterterrorism Law Enforcement Forum will further boost and bolster our collective efforts to address the global REMVE threat. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for allowing me these few minutes. Tom, back over to you.
Thank you, Irfan, for that great overview of all the actions that are going on in the United States. I'd particularly like to also recognize our appreciation for the great support from the State Department Counterterrorism Bureau for the REMVE work that we've been doing so far, and also for the exciting news on the launch of the Law Enforcement Forum, which of course segues quite nicely with the work that we're doing in creating networks within the IIJ's area. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Anna Karin Svensson, Director General for International Affairs for the Ministry of Justice of the Kingdom of Sweden. Dr. Svensson's responsibilities include international cooperation and negotiations in such areas as border control, civilian crisis management, organized crime and terrorism, and also within the areas of penal and civil law. She has a long career with the Ministry of Justice, in which she has served in various posts for the last 15 years, including as Deputy Director and Director at the Division for Police Issues, including Public Order and Safety. I'm looking very much forward to your remarks, Anna Karin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to start by thanking the US State Department and the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law for inviting Sweden to this important side event on how to prevent racial and ethnically motivated violent extremism. It's a timely and pertinent initiative. Today we have gathered to share knowledge and exchange experiences. The threat is real. Innocent people are being targeted, and the sites of attack are difficult to predict. The aim is to install fear and destabilize our democratic societies, and this must be stopped. Just as democratic engagement online can translate into more democratic societies, incitement to violence and hatred online can turn into physical violence. The attack on the 6th of January on US Capitol shocked us all. Racial and ethnically motivated violent extremism go by many names, and a lot of states are struggling with the definition of this movement, which may not be just one movement, but several, sometimes diverse, sometimes united. Even if we call it by different names, we know what we talk about, and we are here today to describe the challenges and how we can work together to tackle them. The Swedish government takes the increased threat posed by the violent right-wing extremist environment very seriously. It's not only a risk for terrorist attacks, racism and xenophobic sentiments create a breeding ground for hate speech and hate crime. These crimes are ultimately a threat not only to the integrity of individuals, but also to the open and democratic society. So what does the threat look like in Sweden? Well, violent right-wing extremism is actually nothing new in the Swedish context. We have had the radical nationalist environment in our country since the 1920s. And in the 1980s, a radical wave of more violent right-wing activists gathered and in different small and violent organizations, and several horrifying attacks and murders followed. The next significant change came in the 1990s with the breakthrough of internet, which also was a breakthrough for building digital platforms. It increased violent far-right activists' possibilities to get into contact and develop their national and cross-border cooperation. And the consequence of the digital development in relation to the violent right-wing extremism is that loose networks today are operating on the internet. So instead of violent right-wing extremism being governed by organization, we see leaderless, loose networks inspiring violent rhetoric and, in a worst-case scenario, violent actions. We know that Swedish activists play a role in this digital and transnational development. The Swedish Security Service underscores that the polarizing rhetoric in society and increasingly blurred line between violent and non-violent group has contributed to the growth of different right-wing extremist movement. And this development has also inspired lone actors to carry out terrorist attacks. The threat posed has also gradually increased. It's more complex and multifaceted now than even a few years ago. Terrorism, a more polarized society, increased online activity, conspiracy theories, mistrust in political institutions have all contributed to this development. And we can see that the ongoing pandemic has been used for increased activities online, for example, spreading conspiracy theories to accelerate mistrust against governments. So how do we in Sweden meet the threat? Well, in addition to detect and investigate criminal activities, it's absolutely essential to decrease the recruitment of individuals into extremist environments and pushing back their growth. Prevention requires collaboration between schools, social services, the police, civil society, etc. And many of the activities are still carried out on the local level. Local actors are the first responders and must have the right tools. There has been a strong demand for guidelines and lessons learned. So for us, prevention is really key. In 2018, the Swedish government established a national center for preventing violent extremism. The center provides support to professionals working at the local level and who are facing challenges with violent extremism and racism in their day-to-day work. The center compiles knowledge and gathers representatives from national agencies and municipalities to exchange experiences and lessons learned. There might also be need for new legislation. Violent right-wing extremism could also be described as organized racism. Racist organization spread racist expressions. It also poses a threat to individuals, as persons within that environment can commit serious violent crimes. An all-party committee has suggested that organized racism and support for organized racism should be criminalized. The Swedish Police Authority, of course, plays an important role in the efforts to better fight and prevent hate crime and have intensified its work to combat all forms of hate crime. The establishment of a national contact point for hate crime illustrates and singles out this form of crime as a priority. Organization-wise, dedicated hate crime units in the 3 metropolitan police regions have been established, and additional resources have been allocated all over the country in every police region. But there is a need to do more, and the Swedish police is developing its capacity and ability to combat cybercrime, including hate crime. And national resources are being further increased, and regional cybercrime centers have been set up and continue their development. Investigations of hate crimes on social media and the internet require particular skills, and the government has therefore commissioned the police to launch a training drive on cybercrime. And the purpose is to strengthen the overall capacity of each police officer to deal with the cyber dimension of crime, including hate crimes. I think we can all agree that an open, free, and secure internet is the foundation for open and democratic societies. We must prevent violent right-wing extremists from using it to their advantage, but at the same time make sure that our responses do not undermine what we aim to protect. We must also work through a multi-stakeholder approach with civil society and the private sector to find better ways to address these issues. But we must also know what we are dealing with. We need more comprehensive knowledge about the violent right-wing extremism and affiliated networks and individuals that act online and offline. Symbols, internet memes, and other messages must be analyzed and explained for practitioners. So in 2016, the government tasked the Swedish Defence Research Agency to map and analyze violent extremist propaganda in digital environments. Now, in 2021, Swedish agencies have more in-depth knowledge about the propaganda, different new developments, and possible risk factors than before. And national agencies can include this in their risk analysis. You will hear more about this in Dr. Lisa Carty's presentation later on. Lastly, I want to underscore the necessity of international cooperation for addressing violent right-wing extremism. It is a cross-border movement which pick up inspirations and spread it around the world in a few seconds, and we must speed up our actions too. Within the EU, we have developed the exchange of knowledge and research, and key for enhancing our collective EU capacity will be the ongoing implementation of the EU regulation to fight terrorism content online. Not only does it lay down new mandates for our competent authorities to order the removal of terrorist content, it will also bring strengthened cooperation involving Europol and service providers. This work also fits well into the broader international context where not least the Christchurch call for action promoted by New Zealand and France and mentioned by Irfan earlier provides great potential. Another example of international cooperation is the knowledge exchange. We had this spring with colleagues at the Home Office in the United Kingdom on the challenges with the violent far right. We highly appreciate such initiatives and plan to continue such bilateral and international exchanges. Because through cooperation, we can pool our collective knowledge and expertise. The practitioner's guide addressing racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism will be presented here today, and the guide as such is a result of international exchange between experts in the field. And I want to thank the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law for this great initiative. Sweden attaches great value to this opportunity today to highlight, together with our American partners, the necessity of joint international focus on the challenges with violent right-wing extremism. And I'm looking forward to hear the rest of the presentation today and active participation from all of you. Thank you very much, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Anna-Karin, and also thank you for that overview of how Sweden has approached this topic. I'd like to personally thank the inspiration that you actually provided to the IIJ in 2019 at the Global Counterterrorism Forum meeting, Sweden had a very strong voice at that time based on some of the research you identified, how important it was for us to start looking collectively at this issue, which ultimately resulted in the development of the REMVE Practitioner Guide, among other actions that we've taken. So I'm looking forward to Dr. Kati's presentation as well as the other two speakers. Now, at this point, we are right on time. It's really great news. I'd like to pass it to Hop Wells, our program manager for the IIJ REMVE initiative, and he will go over some of the questions that we have received, and he'll bring them back to you guys for some responses. So Hop, I pass the floor to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you to both of our speakers. I am following the submissions here through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'd like to pose just a few questions in follow-up. The first question here, and I'll give each of you an opportunity to respond to this, starting with Irfan. This is a big question, but an important one and never more relevant than at this juncture, I think. What have your governments learned from efforts to counter Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and other international terrorist groups over the past 2 decades that will shape your approach to countering REMVE threats? Irfan, I'll let you respond to this one first.
Thank you, Hop. Anna Karin, again, thank you for your great remarks as well. You know, when you talk about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you know, we've had 20 some odd years of fighting those adversaries and still fighting in many parts of the world. So we have learned a lot. We've done a lot. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years. But I should note that as much as we have learned, I think our adversaries in the REMVE space have learned as well. They've been paying attention the last so many years. They understand what our capabilities are. They understand how we've adapted so that now that they are in the middle of this radicalization, recruitment, mobilization, and inspiration, they're doing it in a way that's trying to do better than what we had put forth as a global community. So I think we as a global community need to get better. We need to adapt. We need to look at what we've done the last 20 years and highlight our successes, but also not rest on those successes. So I'll just highlight maybe a couple of things that come to mind when it comes to some of the things that we've learned and done better over the last 20 years. And a lot of this tracks with how I've seen things really in my career, both working as a prosecutor and then working domestically and then now internationally. I would say the first thing is information sharing. I think we've done a lot better over the last couple of years in information sharing, not only by and between law enforcement officials, but also with local communities, making sure that we share the knowledge that we have with local communities who are always the front lines, if you will. So, getting even better community policing efforts in certain communities around the world has been very important. I would say things like border security and the ability for us to exchange information on who's traveling. I think that's very important. I would say things like sanctions and designations have increased, and we've done a very good job of using those designations and sanctions authorities around the world. Better criminal justice sector tools, again, like the workshop we're doing today, like the guidebook that I held up earlier. We didn't have a lot of this the last few years. And then, of course, as Anna Karin mentioned, prevention is so important. And I think that is where we really come a long way over the last 20 years is understanding the need to focus on prevention, looking at building a better awareness of how individuals are radicalizing and mobilizing to violence, building better intervention programs that we didn't have many years ago, off-ramping individuals who might be on the pathway to violence. And the last thing I'll note is this protection of soft targets as well. I think in the last couple of years, we've understood that you cannot stop every attack. You cannot prevent every attack. So we must do what we can to ensure that we're protecting all of our soft targets from, houses of worships to public gathering and the like. So let me stop there, turn it back over to you. A great question.
Thank you, Irfan. Anna Karin, I'll give you an opportunity to answer the same question. What has the Swedish government learned from efforts to counter Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other international terrorist groups over the past 2 decades that will shape your approach to countering the REMVE threat?
Well, yes, and thank you to Irfan for identifying so many good lessons that I think we collectively learned on tools and sanctions and information sharing also. I think for us, as I said in my presentation, prevention is really key. I think it's extremely important that we nip the problems in the bud, so to speak, so that we can intervene early when we see a small problem instead of having to intervene much later when the problem has grown much larger. So I think that is one of the most important issues, and that's also why we started this Center Against Violent Extremism, which looks at threats from all parts of the spectrum: right-wing extremism, Islamist extremism, left-wing extremism, and what have you. And I think also one thing that we have learned is to never lose sight of the problems. You see threat from different groups, they go up and down over time. And you think when you put the leaders in prison and you have control over that group or that kind of environment, then that you have solved the problem, but that's not the case. And then you start focusing on something other, and then all of a sudden the threat pops up again. I think it's important to always keep sight on environments that you have once identified. So keeping track and also involving not only security services, they can keep track and have good information, but also involve research. They have a lot of possibilities to identify and help us identify environments and potential problems popping up in the near future, and give us more knowledge and research. I think also we have seen that there are, of course, many differences between the Islamist environment and the REMVE environment. For instance, the presence on the internet, online, how we see many different actors and lone actors in the REMVE environment, very hard to track and anonymous, popping up, and we don't know how they're connected. So I think that's some of the lessons we learned so far. So let's keep informing each other and sharing information. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much. The other question here, and both of you have touched on this in what you've said so far, but I think it'd be valuable for our audience to hear both of you address it squarely and add anything more. I'll turn it back to Irfan first here. In thinking about what a whole of society approach could look like to this challenge, which types of civil society or other non-government actors are the most effective and available partners in addressing REMVE, as opposed to addressing different types of violent extremist threats? Irfan, I'll give it to you first.
Yeah, thanks. And again, great question. And I think there are probably two areas we need to focus on. Number one is when you're talking about countering any type of radicalization to violence and the grievances that fuel that radicalization, we have to look at the bedrock civil rights and civil liberties that I mentioned earlier. When you're violating someone's civil rights and civil liberties, it does create these grievances that help fuel radicalization to violence. So when we talk about, I think the first step in countering any type of violent extremism and preventing any type of violent extremism, we have to look at maybe our civil society actors and our partners there to ensure that everything we're doing is based in the fundamental protections that we have in our human rights and our civil rights, but also importantly in our civil liberties. Another area, of course, is local communities. We have to do better at engaging our local communities, not from a perspective of government to communities or law enforcement to communities, but as partners in resilience. I think that's the sort of tagline that we try to use in our government's PCVE work, which is partners in resilience. Let us provide you with the information that you might need, but you should be the first line of defense. You should be the one to care for your communities. And we just are there to provide those necessary resources, the information sharing that's needed. But I think Anna Karen talked about the technology sector. And I think that's so important because, especially on the REMVE side, they've really understood the value of misusing online platforms. But more importantly, they've really understood how you can leverage misinformation and disinformation and actually weaponize misinformation and disinformation. So we have to do a much better job of identifying for our partners around the world what misinformation and disinformation looks like, and then give the resilience, give the capabilities to our young kids around the world who are the first lines of defense, who are the ones who are susceptible and vulnerable. We have to have them understand better what misinformation is and what disinformation is. And earlier on, I talked about some of the programs and initiatives that the State Department has. And one of them is focused on, university students really understanding how to look at what's on the internet, build that resilience so that they can help each other understand how dangerous misinformation and disinformation is. And I think Anna Karen and I both talked about the Christchurch call to action, but let me also give a shout out to the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, and of course our partners at Tech Against Terrorism, two very important platforms that are doing a lot of the work, working by and through Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Twitter, and not only the big companies that we all know and all the apps that we have on our phones, but some of the apps that our kids might have on their phones that we might not have, some of the other platforms that are being used that might not have the same ability to track the type of misinformation and disinformation that happens on their platforms. So I think as you talk about designing this whole of society approach, I would argue that it's those two areas that we really need to focus on as we continue this global fight to counter REMVE. Back over to you.
Thank you, Irfan. Anna Karen, let me also give you an opportunity to give your perspective on this. Which types of actors do you see as the most effective, the most available partners in addressing REMVE threats?
Well, I can totally agree on what Irfan said. I think he said it all really, but it's the same kind of actors that we see that have to be there. It's the local actors, the municipalities, the police, the schools, and so on, and civil society. I think also researchers, as I said, we have to map the problems. We have to understand what does misinformation look like, as Irfan said, and be sure that the service providers are with us on this. And I think also that even though it's the same actors, it's the same kind of threats, we sometimes need to have a bit of different glasses on. It's sometimes harder to identify homegrown terrorism or right-wing extremism. It's something that we see right among ourselves. It's hard to sort of single out what is the threat. When there's something coming from abroad, from outside, it's easier to see this as a threat and be aware. But when it's homegrown, it sort of grows on you before you realize that it's already there and it's big and we haven't done anything about it because it's more part of the normal background noise, so to speak. So I think the same kind of actors and the same kind of sensibilities, but we have to look a little bit more broader and be more aware of what is happening and make use of the actors that can help us see the situations arising at an early stage. Over to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you both for those responses and for sharing your perspectives more generally with us today. I do want to keep us on schedule, so we will now move to our second panel. We have three more distinguished speakers who are going to discuss the ways that REMVE actors and networks pose a threat, which is both urgent and again, different from other types of violent extremist threats, and give us some more detail on developments in those actors' recruitment, propaganda, and planning. Just a reminder to everyone listening that throughout, you can continue to submit questions for our speakers using the Q&A function here on Zoom, and then at the end, I'll pose as many of those as we have time for following all three sets of remarks. The first speaker will be Dr. Rafi Grigorian, Director and Deputy Undersecretary General for the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. He has over 30 years of academic, diplomatic, and military experience in counterterrorism and international peace and security. Before joining the UN, he was Director of Multilateral Affairs in the Bureau of Counterterrorism of the U.S. Department of State. Previously held a number of senior positions with the Department of State, including Acting Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Director for the Office of Peace Operations, Sanctions, and Counterterrorism. Rafi, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm tickled at the notion that I'm a distinguished speaker. I'm more like an extinguished speaker. But in any event, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And let me first of all, thank the United States of America, Sweden, and our colleagues from the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law for organizing this timely side event on racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. It has been very encouraging to see momentum for action and cooperation building up to tackle this pressing transnational threat and concrete initiatives starting to bear fruit. As an example, the launch of, in July, that was mentioned earlier, the IIJ Criminal Justice Practitioner's Guide for Addressing REMVE, which we are highlighting here today. The United Nations system looks forward to stepping up engagement and cooperation with member states and all our partners in this regard, including the Global Counterterrorism Forum and its inspired institutions. In February this year, the Secretary General called for global coordinated action to tackle this threat. The General Assembly has now given the international community a clear and strong signal for this in the Comprehensive Resolution 75/291 that it adopted by consensus at the end of June for the 7th review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. The General Assembly called upon member states to take appropriate measures to address the threats posed by the rise in terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, including through investigation, information exchange, and cooperation. And it requested the United Nations system to help member states develop effective counter-narratives, capacities, and strategies to tackle this threat. The relative importance and the manifestations of this specific phenomenon vary around the world, and member states had long discussions to strike compromise terminology given their respective legal, cultural, and political traditions and contexts. It is especially important for the credibility of international counterterrorism efforts that member states displayed such unity, and the outcome of the negotiations is clear and true to one of the basic tenets of the strategy. Terrorism should be combated in all its forms and manifestations. So we should leverage the solid normative framework and practical tools that we have developed over the past 20 years to prevent and counter this resurgent form of terrorism through a holistic and whole of society approach, anchored into the rule of law, human rights, and gender equality. The General Assembly has mandated the Secretary General to submit a dedicated report by the end of August next year on the phenomenon of terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, which UNOCT looks forward to preparing in consultation with member states and with insights from civil society. Among United Nations partners, we have already held numerous rounds of discussions on this growing threat, including a meeting of the Secretary General's High-Level Action Group on Preventing Violent Extremism, which I briefed in December last year. The objective has been to improve our own understanding of the phenomenon, the legal, human rights, and gender aspects, and the need to encourage member states to follow a principled, consistent, and multidimensional response. When we look at today's global terrorism landscape, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates remain the predominant threat, particularly in conflict zones. That threat persists in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, while the security situation in many parts of Africa is deteriorating at an alarming rate. But the threat from other hateful movements, such as neo-Nazism and white supremacy, has been on a clear upward trend for a number of years. It stems from a resurgence of the type of violent, racist, supremacist worldview against which the United Nations was founded more than 75 years ago after the defeat of Nazism, fascism, and militarism. Terrorism based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance is today the fastest growing and even the most serious threat for several member states in Western Europe, North America, and Oceania. The underlying surge in alienation and radicalization can be traced back to the socioeconomic and cultural anxieties and grievances in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. For some countries, this was followed by the so-called migrant crisis that peaked in 2015. In some societies, it is rooted in even deeper unresolved legacies of colonialism and slavery. Over the past 2 years, we saw how racially, ethnically, or ideologically motivated individuals and groups have sought to exploit the COVID-19 crisis and the related tsunami of misinformation and hatred to increase and diversify their support base. They have taken advantage of an increasingly polarized mainstream discourse over the years to hijack legitimate public debate over societal challenges. These groups are both organizationally and ideologically fragmented. They are more like a fluid and leaderless milieu of unaffiliated individuals inspired by key figures they hold as icons and stirring up each other's and sometimes coalescing into small groups. And when they mobilize into action, some resort to terrorist tactics, mostly in the form of low-cost, low-tech copycat attacks targeting soft and symbolic targets, a modus operandi popularized by Daesh. The difficulties this poses to prevent, detect, and disrupt plots are well known to intelligence and law enforcement agencies and were discussed in the first section. These hateful groups and individuals exhibit a smorgasbord of ideological motivations, which to varying degrees include xenophobia, neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racial supremacism, ultranationalism, intolerance related to sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. They recruit among disaffected individuals and often exploit anti-government or anti-establishment sentiments. Youth culture, including online video games and adjacent platforms, mixed martial arts or hard rock music, and gender dynamics combining toxic masculinities and misogyny with specific efforts to recruit women and girls to proselytize and legitimize in a dizzying cocktail of cognitive dissonance. The transnational dimensions of this phenomena have become increasingly clear as member states step up intelligence, investigations, and exchange information. This includes not only international travel and networking, but also connections and mutual and reinforcing inspiration in cyberspace through which like-minded individuals link up and hate speech and terrorist content spread across borders. Their savvy use of the darknet and digital technologies present frontier challenges, including the use of cryptocurrencies for financing, gamification and recruitment efforts, an ecosystem of social media platforms and websites resilient to takedown operations, and narratives that use ambivalent and coded language to avoid being classified as unlawful speech. Ladies and gentlemen, as a contribution to our discussions today, I want to also highlight two overarching challenges to confront terrorism based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, which have been raised in the many exchanges I have had with practitioners on this topic in recent months. First, legal clarity and policy consistency. Member states must have a clear definition on terrorism in full compliance with international law, including human rights. We need to be mindful that overly broad definitions of terrorism in domestic law can negatively affect human rights. Also, we must avoid conflating terrorism, violent extremism, hate crimes, and hate speech, which could result in an overextensive application of the counterterrorism framework. At the same time, each state must also apply its national definition and counterterrorism approach consistently in similar situations, regardless of the background and or perceived motivations of the individuals or groups involved, in order not to create impressions of double standards. This might actually be one of the most important lessons from 20 years of counterterrorism. The failure to uphold human rights, especially violations committed by security forces, give terrorists recruitment tools for free. Second, dedicated focus and tailored approach. More expertise needs to be developed, partnerships built with academia, civil society, and the private sector, and in-depth research conducted to get a solid grip of the threat. That, as we've heard again in the first panel, is ongoing. But it's necessary not only to detect and disrupt attacks and bring offenders to justice, but more importantly, perhaps, to take decisive preventive action so that the threat does not metastasize to the levels we have seen with Al-Qaeda and Daesh. The best way to fight this violent extremist fringe is not through suppression alone, but by making society more resilient and less vulnerable to its appeal. This requires preventive efforts such as counter narratives and community engagement to be based on solid empirical analysis to address the underlying grievances and challenge hateful narratives. UNOCT now has a clear mandate on this pressing issue, and our global program on preventing and countering violent extremism is a good example of how UN entities are already leveraging their existing work to address the rise in terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, or other forms of intolerance. As part of these efforts, we are seeking to spearhead research and collaboration on countering the increasing use of online gaming platforms by neo-Nazi, white supremacists, and other violent groups. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is fully committed to working with and helping requesting member states as mandated by the recent review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy by the General Assembly. We invite member states to fully leverage the United Nations comparative advantages on preventing and countering terrorism to contribute to tackling the rise in terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance. Helping foster a shared understanding of the threat, harmonized approaches based on human rights and the rule of law, and joint action to tackle transnational dimensions are key to a global coordinated approach. More can be done and more should be done, and we look forward to engaging in additional projects and programs with interested member states, partners, and donors. Taking action against this threat will save lives and demonstrate that the fight against terrorism is not targeted against any religion, nationality, or ethnicity, but against the most abhorrent form of violence and the hateful ideologies that drive them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafi. I would next like to introduce Mr. Rob McCare, CMG. Rob is a director in the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. He has previously served as the head of counterterrorism policy, as well as ambassador to Iran, high commissioner to Kenya, and on diplomatic postings in Romania and Washington. Rob, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers and the other speakers. It's a great privilege to be speaking at this event alongside our UN, US, and Swedish partners, and an appreciation for all the work that the International Institute for Justice does in this area. I'd like to pick up on what some of the other speakers have said, and I'll try not to repeat the ground that's already been covered. When we're talking about what we call extreme right-wing terrorism, others call by range of names, including REMVE, it's easy to get stuck into our national silos. And I think this week of the General Assembly is always a good opportunity to get together in events and remind ourselves of the transnational, international cooperation, the exchange of experience and ideas that we can benefit from. It's a virtual event, but some of us are actually here in New York in person, and I think it's difficult to be here in mid-September, any September, particularly 20 years on from 9/11, and not to think about how much we've moved on and how much we've learned in the 20 years since that day when the world changed. And certainly for those of us who were at that time involved in the counterterrorism world, it's a very resonant time to be having this discussion. And to remind ourselves that terrorism is not any one thing. We need constantly to stretch our imagination about emerging and potential threats if we're going to counter them. So just a few thoughts about the extreme right-wing threat. As the IIJ's practitioner's guide that's been talked about already points out, the threat from REMVE is linked internationally and is enabled by the online environment. How does it manifest in the UK? Well, since 2017, when Darren Osborne attacked worshippers outside the Finsbury Park Mosque, nearly a third of the disrupted terrorist plots in the UK have been inspired by extreme right-wing ideologies. All of the successful REMVE attacks were perpetrated by self-initiated terrorists, individuals with no known connection to wider REMVE groups. And that's the primary manifestation of the REMVE threat in the UK. Perpetrators have no single profile. They can conduct attacks as a result of numerous different personal and situational factors, making them really difficult to identify and disrupt. Throughout 2020, there were 185 CT-related arrests in the UK, and 23% of those related to suspected REMVE. So we don't underestimate the need for the whole of the CT community, and indeed society more broadly, to take the threat seriously. And internationally, as others have mentioned, Irfan mentioned the list of countries where sadly these events have taken place, and the links between them. So one of the UK perpetrators, for example, praised the Christchurch attacks and committed his act of terrorism in response the very next day. In terms of networking, before the group National Action was prescribed in the UK, we know that it sought to forge connections to like-minded groups and individuals in the US, in Germany, in Ukraine, Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, and Poland. So disruption of these groups is going to require concerted multi-stakeholder cooperation across international partners and across law enforcement and industry to ensure that efforts are coordinated and effective. There was a bit of discussion earlier about the differences between extreme right-wing terrorism and Islamist jihadi terrorism. From our point of view, REMVE has many similarities to other forms of terrorism, of course, the low cost, low sophistication nature of attacks, but there are also significant differences which we have to take into account. One of them is that REMVE groups don't fit a typical group structure, and I think Rafi was mentioning this just now, that there's often no hierarchy of individuals with a single aim or plan, and the ideologies that individuals subscribe to are often in flux, and that makes detection and disruption very difficult. Another thing that we've seen is the changing demographic of individuals involved, with the increasing frequency of minors and young people being involved. So back in 2015, young people under the age of 24 accounted for less than 20% of REMVE arrests in the UK. And in 2020, last year, they accounted for nearly 60%. And I think it's well known that the so-called leader of the REMVE group, Feuerkrieg Division, which the UK prescribed in July 2020, was a 13-year-old boy based in Estonia. And then, of course, as others have mentioned today, the prevalence of conspiracy theories and misinformation are a significant part of this threat, particularly engaging for a younger audience. And extremists are using memes and conspiracy theories as a way of hooking in young and vulnerable people on social media platforms before luring them to closed chat rooms and other encrypted channels where they expose them to more extreme narratives and illegal material. Coming on to disruption, our counterterrorism strategy in the UK is designed to be threat agnostic and as such to have a range of flexible tools that enables the UK to combat all threats, including that from REMVE. And obviously one of the main tools is prescription. It's key for disruption both in the real world and online. It sends a strong message that terrorist groups are not tolerated, and it deters them from operating nationally by criminalizing membership and support of the groups. So far, we've prescribed 5 extreme right-wing terrorist groups. Moving on to prevention, which Anna Karin talked about, we have a program called Prevent, which seeks to tackle the causes of radicalization and respond to the ideological challenge of terrorism in all its forms, including REMVE, through encouraging disengagement from harmful narratives. It offers a wide range of support to the individuals, which includes help with education or career advice, dealing with mental or emotional health issues, drug or alcohol abuse, and theological or ideological mentoring from a specialist mentor. So that program and other disengagement programs like it are particularly important in disengaging young people from REMVE. On the international response, first of all, obvious point, sharing experience and ideas in events like this and through the sort of practitioner exchanges that Anna Karin was talking about is really important. I certainly already learned a lot from today's event, and I'm sure others have as well. Then I'd like to also flag up the importance of working with the private sector, including through the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, to encourage an international collaboration to tackle illegal REMVE content online. And as Irfan said, a lot of companies have really stepped up to that, but there's a lot more to do. During our presidency of the G7 this year, REMVE has been part of the G7 Interior and Security Ministerial discussions. And obviously, we think that international collaboration is absolutely crucial in tackling the transnational nature of the threat. And we're using our G7 presidency to do that. So that's a pretty quick gallop through how we see the challenge and what we can all do collectively and separately about it. There have been some really interesting comments about the whole of society response. And one of the things about this threat, I think, is that it goes so much wider than the standard counterterrorism practice that a lot of us feel comfortable with. And we have to stretch ourselves to deal with that. I'd like to thank the IIJ for arranging the event and everyone who's attending it. It's great to participate in a group of like-minded people who share the same objective of striving constantly to find ways to keep our societies safe from these sorts of threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I would finally like to introduce Dr. Lisa Kati from the Swedish Defense Research Agency. She is a senior scientist and the group leader of a multidisciplinary data science group at the agency. She's also the project leader of a commission from the Swedish government about analyzing violent extremism in digital environments, and she conducts research on social media from a security perspective, including on digital hate, threat assessment, and the implications of algorithms and AI for our society. Lisa, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me, and it has been really interesting to listen to all the speakers, and unfortunately I am the last one, so you might hear things again that you have heard others speak about. So as Anna-Karin and Hoop mentioned, I have been working on a commission from the Swedish government since 2016 with the aim to map violent extremism online and to learn more about narratives and the language of extremism in the online space. Today, I will try to give you some insights about REMVE in digital environments and some of the traits that characterize such extremism online. In my work, I use computerized methods to detect and measure different aspects of digital phenomena. And our research also focuses on how we can use such methods to develop new methods for example, threat assessment of individuals that are active in the online sphere. And we have done this kind of research together with several law enforcement in Europe and also in the US. So the online scene of REMVE is extremely difficult to analyze. It can perhaps be described as some kind of ideology. And the hard part is that REMVE content can be found almost everywhere on the internet. When studying REMVE online, there are mainly two kinds of platforms that you can find on the internet. First of all, there are dedicated platforms that are fully dedicated to a certain ideology or an organization. And then there are also regular platforms that are just platforms that host any kind of discussions and communication. Among the ideological platforms, we can find a lot of discussion forums, such as the white supremacy forum Stormfront, that has been online since the mid-90s. Stormfront describes itself as a community of racial realists, idealists, and white nationalists. And several offenders that have been talked about today and that have also committed violent attacks that were racially and ethnically motivated can be found in this user base of Stormfront. While most of the posts that are published on Stormfront are in English, there are also a number of sub-forums that focuses on certain regions and countries, such as, for example, France, Spain, and also the Nordic countries. While discussion forum has played an important role for the online extremist scene, there are also a lot of traditional websites that promote hate and violence. One of the most well-known websites is the Daily Stormer that was founded in 2013. The Daily Stormer gained a lot of publicity after they published abusive comments about the woman who was killed in connection with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017. The publishing led to a shutdown of the website, and since at that time, all major internet service providers refused to host the site, it was forced to move to the more difficult to access dark web. But after some time and change of provider and internet address, the Daily Stormer is again up and running on the open web. Apart from the ideologically motivated platform, we can also find REMVE content on, I would say, all social media platforms. But in particular, we find it on the so-called minimal moderation platforms. When major social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram increased their efforts to counter hate speech, for example, a number of minimal moderation platforms appeared. Many of the minimal moderation platform mimics the original platform, and you can almost see them as the evil twin. One such example is Gab, which is a platform that have almost the exact same functionality as Twitter, but they have a very lax moderation. The minimal moderation platform brands themselves as a so-called free speech platform that allows any kind of content as long as it is legal. Some of the minimal moderation platform have been in partnership with the European law enforcement to remove certain content, for example, propaganda from terrorist groups such as IS, while other minimal moderation platform refuse to collaborate with law enforcement. Online REMVE is united not only by ideological content, but it is also united by a certain characteristic regarding how they use language, symbols, and other imagery. The practice of dog whistling is often used to communicate REMVE content on social media as a way to bypass censorship algorithms. An example of dog whistling is when words are, for example, misspelled on purpose to express something. And another example is when, for example, scare quotes are used around a word or a phrase to draw an attention to an inaccurate use. A common use of scare quotes is, for example, to put it around Holocaust as a sign of Holocaust denial. So there are mainly two things that characterize REMVE content. It's the justification of violence and also the incitement of violence. One way to justify violence towards specific groups is to use a very toxic language and to target certain groups. In my research, we have measured the level of toxic language and also analyzed the targets of the toxic language on a wide range of digital platforms. The level of the toxic language differs. On some platforms, mostly the ideologically dedicated platforms, almost 20% of the posts can be considered toxic, while other platforms, such as Twitter and Reddit, have less than 1% toxic posts. The target of the toxic language varies. We see enemies such as Jews, Muslim, and non-white. We also see that so-called white traitors, which is white groups who sort of betray their race by marrying people of color or by not caring about the so-called race war or even voting for the wrong parties are target. But we also see that women are target. Another way to justify violence is to use dehumanization, which means that you deny that a person or a group possess all the traits that actually makes them human. In the digital space, we found that dehumanization was directed towards many, many different groups, including Muslims, Jews, Middle Eastern immigrants, dark-skinned people, and people in interracial relationships. The list can actually be very long. Conspiracy theories also provides an explanation of important events in terms of some secret plot that is staged by a constellation of powerful and evil actors. And this is also a common way to justify violence towards those powerful and evil actors that stage the secret plot. There are some examples of how violence towards certain groups are justified. The online space is also characterized by incitement to violence. For example, we see that a subculture have grown around previous REMVE violent offenders that are praised for their deeds and commended for successfully killing others. These offenders are regarded as heroes or saints, and they gain a following of people who find them extremely inspirational. Several of the offenders to the attack we have seen during the last couple of years seem to have been radicalized mainly online, and we also know that they inspire each other. We can also see subcultures like the siege culture raise and gain popularity online. Siege culture promotes racist violence and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and Holocaust denial. It also urges lone actor or small terrorist cells to attack as a way to create chaos and spark a civil war that will destroy society as it is today. So, what can we do about it? Well, we have heard many good ideas from the speakers today, but we need to be aware of the online scene and that a large amount of the communication that is happening today takes place on the online scene. This puts a large pressure on the social media platforms that have an important job to do, since they have the power to decide what kind of content that we should allow on the internet. We also have to be aware that we have to continue to develop the use of AI and technologies that can automatically detect and moderate content, especially important for small platforms that don't have the manual resources. But we also have to acknowledge that it's extremely difficult. It's a continuous cat and mouse game between the content, the one who create the content and the ones who are trying to detect it. So thank you very much for listening, and Hope, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. We do have a few minutes remaining still for questions. I think for this Q&A, in order to cover more ground, I'm going to pose a different follow-up question to each speaker. Rafi, I will turn back to you first. Thinking about the UN's own comparative advantages in countering REMVE, you already gave a pretty comprehensive description of the approach right now. Can you envisage at some point in the future an international sanctions regime, like the 1267 sanctions regime, against these types of actors? And would the different terminology that a number of speakers have referred to that different states still use for these threats be an obstacle to that? What would it take for a sanctions regime to be justified? What would it take for a sanctions regime to be effective, in your view? I'll give you a chance to respond there.
Thank you. It's a great question. It has to remain in the realm of conjecture, though, and personal opinion, because sanctions typically or almost exclusively are the domain of the Security Council. So it would depend on the complexion of the Security Council, by which I mean the elected 10 members that might be in place at a time when members wish to consider such a regime. And my personal feeling is it would take probably some kind of unfortunate major incident to galvanize the council into the recognition of the truly transnational nature of the threat and also of the need to take action. That's not to say that they couldn't include certain travel bans and financial freezes in the context of country-specific resolutions, but in terms of a broad global one on the theme of whatever you want to call it, REMVE, I don't think we're there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if people start considering it the more they learn about it. I don't see it, again, personal opinion, I don't see it being amended or added on to the existing Al-Qaeda and Daesh sanctions regime. That being said, that certainly is, as a transnational threat, the Security Council has the ability to take action against it if members agree on that. And I think it's one of those areas where, as we learn more about the transnational linkages, particularly through financing and travel, these are instruments that the Security Council has at its disposal that would be effective, I think, against these targets, but against individuals perhaps, and less so against groups, unless, of course, there are certain kinds of groups that transcend the political differences of the Security Council. I think safe to say that nobody likes Nazis, for example. So if there's a clearly neo-Nazi group you might see action against that, and you would want to probably or could anticipate action against a group which is sort of manifestly heinous as a starting point. But again, I think it takes a catalyst of an unfortunate major violent incident to do that. But I don't think the tools are there for enforcement. Also, I think the interesting phenomenon here is most of what we're talking about is confined to certain countries in North America, Northern Europe, Oceania, parts of Eastern Europe, where the recognition of the threat is open. And the countries themselves are already taking action, so they can certainly take action bilaterally and multilaterally amongst themselves without requiring the UN to do that. But obviously, a UN regime would be much more powerful. But because the phenomenon itself seems to be, for the time being, confined to those countries, if they were to craft a resolution that made that clear, I think it might have more chance of consideration and adoption. But it is fundamentally a role of the Security Council. I don't think the terminology is as big of a stumbling block as most people think. That's why I say if they just decide on the parameters of what kind of behavior these groups are involved in, they can address the threat. Just as we still don't have a comprehensive convention against terrorism, but that hasn't stopped the Security Council from issuing a whole number of resolutions on the subject of terrorism. Over.
Thank you very much for that. I will turn to Rob next. This is something that a number of speakers have touched on in passing, but I want to give you the chance to address it directly. What impact has the COVID-19 pandemic, society's experience with lockdowns, the changing controversial role of vaccines now in societies had on REMVE threats from what you've seen either within the UK or transnationally? Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, a couple of people have touched on this. I mean, it is a really interesting question. I think, what we've seen, so we've identified short-term impacts. We're less sure about the long-term. Obviously, it's possible to identify the fact that actually during lockdowns, terrorist planning and opportunities have been curtailed a bit. But then on the other side of the coin, the increased time that people have spent online and the lack of social interaction has certainly increased the potential for radicalization and for malign online activity. And radicalization of vulnerable individuals. So I think, it's easy to speculate about it. And in particular, we can all see the narratives around COVID conspiracy theories and anti-vaccine narratives and so on. And we can speculate that this will create more of a background justification for people to become radicalized into these REMVE violent acts. But I think it's really important to be evidence-based when we look at these situations and not to jump to conclusions. It is too early to say what the impact will actually be. And this goes to obviously to a much wider question. Again, a couple of other speakers have mentioned of some of the challenges in society and the way society is changing in a number of different places around the world that creates more space for the underlying ideologies that allow terrorism to grow up in this space. But I think what it comes down to in practical terms, if you look at this, what the pandemic has done and the situations that are being created, it just reiterates so strongly what we need to do practically and to redouble our efforts on preventing terrorists' misuse of the internet and of social media. And that is the practical thing, the practical tool we have at our disposal. These things are just very difficult to measure. Over.
Thank you, Rob. I finally want to go back, Lisa, to you and pick up on something you said quickly in closing and give you just another 2 minutes maybe to expand on that a little bit, which is the tech sector's own response to the REMVE threat online and the way governments are working with tech companies. How would you assess that at this point? What should tech companies and governments in working with the tech sector be doing more of, or maybe doing less of, or doing differently than they've been doing to this point?
So I think, there are a lot of ongoing activities by numerous stakeholders to include, I mean, the Tech Against Terrorism have been mentioned here, for example, but also the EU Internet Forum. So many large social media platforms, of course, join these initiatives, but there are still many, many platforms that don't join these initiatives and that probably never will join them. So I think one challenge is to, of course, motivate the owners of these free speech platforms to engage in a dialogue with the rest of us on what kind of content that we should allow on their platforms. Because these platforms, they are not that small and fringe. I mean, if we look at 4chan, for example, they have 43 million visitors per month. So it's not just like a small fringe platform, it's like a very large platform. Yeah, so I think trying to convince everyone to have a dialogue on what kind of content that we should allow on a platform is an important task that we need to work more on. And continue, of course, to work with the platforms that are already engaged in this. And over to you, Hope.
Great, thank you very much. With that, I think we are about ready to close here, and I want to say thank you to all of our speakers for those thoughtful and I think really useful insights today. Thank you to everyone who participated, submitted questions from all around the world. I will now quickly pass the floor again to Thomas Wuchti, the IAJ's Executive Secretary.
Thank you, Hop. I echo those thanks, and I would like to first and foremost express again the thanks to Sweden and the United States for supporting the IAJ REMVE initiative and this side event at UNGA. Also to all of our speakers, it was great remarks, really insightful, and the Q&A was also quite good. I'd like to thank our translators out there. We always appreciate the great work that you do, and also our tech team, and of course Hop to my right, as well as Roxalana, who some of you worked with to organize this. You can access the Practitioner's Guide online. Again, it's in Arabic, French, Russian, Spanish, as well as English. And in the coming months, as has been previously said, the IAJ will use the guide as the basis for capacity building workshops. Because in the end, we are truly trying to raise the bar of cooperation, and we're not looking to point fingers and work on this together collectively. It really is our hope in the IAJ. We look forward to potentially collaborating with many of you. Please reach out to us with your ideas and thoughts on how to move this important issue forward. I'm really happy that we were able to do this meeting today. We've stayed on time. Thank you for all your time, and I wish everybody good health in the coming weeks and months ahead. Thank you from the IAJ.